What's the greatest? Fine, I'll do it myself. In history. Canadian soldier Leo Major and his friend Willie Arsenault were scouting a Dutch town called Zwolle that had been captured by Germans in World War II. On this scouting trip, the two had decided to liberate Zwolle together, but were spotted and Arsenault was brought down. Major, enraged, killed 2 German soldiers while the rest fled. On the outskirts of the town, Major intercepted a vehicle, disarming the soldiers there. He told a French-speaking German soldier that all the Canadian artillery would be firing on the town in the morning, and left him free to spread the rumor, even returning his weapon as a total alpha move. That night, Major decided to single-handedly liberate the town. Arming himself with many weapons, he made explosions and noise, making it sound like the entire Canadian army was there. Several times that night, Major went back and forth from Zwolle to the Canadian base, taking 8 to 10 German prisoners each time. At one point, Major located the enemy headquarters and raided it himself. He killed several officers and the rest fled. By morning, Major discovered that the Germans who had taken Zwolle had entirely retreated. I should also mention that Major was a sniper who only had one eye from a phosphorus grenade explosion years prior, and had remained in the military because he insisted he only needed one eye to aim his weapon, and that to him, he looked like a pirate. The Dutch town of Zwolle was liberated by a one-eyed sniper. He has several other legendary acts, but this to me was the best. Damn, I just did some more reading on this guy. He was also in the Normandy invasion on D-Day, and single-handedly captured an entire German vehicle that contained communication equipment and codes. After he lost his eye, but before this incident, this motherfricker single-handedly captured 100 German soldiers. He started with one, killed the soldier's friend, then used his prisoner to force that commanding officer to surrender. As he was leading a group of prisoners back to the Canadian front lines, the enemy spotted him and opened fire. Major gave 0 Fs and continued on his merry way, dropped the first group off, ordered a tank to go and kill his pursuers, then after they got killed, he personally marched the rest of his nearly 100 prisoners back to camp. Why? He was frozen and wet when he saw the first 2 soldiers and wanted them to pay. A general tried to give him the Distinguished Conduct Medal for this, and Major refused because said general was incompetent and in no position to be giving medals. Shortly after, he survived a landmine, and guys, this was still before Zwolle. As if his massive balls weren't big enough already, after World War II he returned to fight in the Korean War and received another Distinguished Conduct Medal. While the Canadian forces were trying to capture a hill that the Chinese were currently defending, Major led 18 men as an elite sniper and scout force to a hill in the middle of the Chinese forces and opened fire. His team were able to take the hill. A couple of hours later, 14,000 Chinese reinforcements returned to take back the hill. Major refused, found cover for his men, and was able to hold back the Chinese throughout the night. I vote Major for baddest Canadian by a landslide. Folks, I understand this might be internet heresy, but is Major more of a real-life baddie than fictional Chuck Norris? Because I know that Chuck Norris can push planet Earth down while training, but he didn't do any of this stuff. Let's not forget that Isaac Newton ran out of math to work with and was like, I guess I'll just invent calculus then. He was self-quarantined during the plague as well. Otis invented pretty much what we consider the modern elevator. Nobody was convinced it was safe, so he hoisted himself up extremely high and had somebody cut the cable with an axe to prove how confident he was that the elevator was safe regardless of almost worst-case scenarios. The safety locking mechanism kicked in and the elevator stopped after only a few inches. He survived. Had it failed there at the New York's World Fair, we probably wouldn't have elevators today. In 1888, Alman Brown Strauger, an undertaker, noticed he was losing a lot of business to the other undertaker in town. He found out that the other undertaker's wife was a telephone operator, and when she intercepted people asking to be connected to Strauger's funeral home, the operator would route the call to her husband's funeral home instead. 3 years later, Strauger patented the automatic teller exchange, a system which allowed telephone users to make calls without the need for human operators, single-handedly destroying an entire workforce. Imagine being so teed off that you don't just get someone fired, but remove their job from existence entirely. Cliff Stoll, of the Cuckoo's Egg fame, noticed weird traffic on his university servers. No one believed him that there was any risk occurring. Ended up uncovering a major hacking attempt to steal missile designs and basically created internet security. John Snow. Not that one, the father of epidemiology. No one believed him that the cholera outbreak in what is now Soho was because of a contaminated water pump. He broke it. They arrested him for vandalism and held him until the outbreak suddenly ended. He was also a pioneer when it came to anesthetics. Queen Victoria permitted him to put her under for the birth of her 2 children. I visited his memorial in Brompton Cemetery a few years ago. He's right around the corner from Emmeline Pankhurst's grave. Both sites had fresh flowers on them. Donald Knuth is one of the big names in computer science. Back in the 1960s, he set out to write the definitive texts on computer programming and analysis of algorithms. The first 3 volumes came out, and he started the 4th in the early to mid-1970s. He was unhappy with how the newer printing editions were typeset, and so he took a summer to solve that problem. A decade later, the 4th volume had still not been completed. But as a consolation prize, we got TEX, later extended to the more commonly used LaTeX, without question the most comprehensive and powerful language for creating documents with heavy technical requirements. It's a strange mix of a markup language like HTML and a compiled language like C. It's completely free and has been for well over 30 years, and is probably the most bug-free piece of software I've ever seen. Certainly for its size and scope, there's not much out there of comparable quality. There is literally no mathematics that cannot be properly typeset in TEX or LaTeX. Its default style is instantly recognizable to any working mathematician. It's used across nearly all STEM fields, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that only accept manuscripts written in LaTeX. It wasn't until the early 2000s that drafts of the 4th volume started to appear. Nobody has seemed to mind. Probably the time that Nando Parrado and Robert Canessa decided that they couldn't wait any longer and legged it for 10 days across the Andes with no warm clothes, climbing gear, or food, except some scraps of their dead friends stuffed into a sock. They literally found someone out in the middle of nowhere, Sergio Catalan, who rode horseback all night and then took a bus to get some help. The mountain climbers had come from the wreckage of a crashed plane that everyone had been looking for over 2 months. They needed help for the other survivors who were injured and starving. They saved 14 of their friends. There's a book written about it by one of the survivors himself. Miracle in the Andes, 72 Days on the Mountain, and My Long Trek Home by Nando Parrado. I never watched the movie, but the book still gets me to this day. It's one of the most disturbing depictions of humans' ability to survive even under the deadliest circumstances. A really humbling read, reminding most of us of our own fragility and how terrible and fleeting everything truly is. It's gotta be Aimo Koivunen. He was a Finnish soldier in the Second World War when the Finns were trying to reclaim land from the Soviets. He got separated from his unit mid-war in the middle of nowhere. He was the one tasked to carry the narcotics they held in case of injury or tiredness, one of which was Pervitin, which was basically crystal in tablet form. Instead of just taking 1 or 2, he downed the whole bottle and went on a weeks-long juiced-up rampage. He got hit by a landmine, evaded Soviet soldiers, caught a bird and ate it raw, all while on skis. He finally made it back to Finnish lines where, on arrival, he weighed only 90 pounds or so and had a heart rate of 200 beats per minute. He ended up living for another 45 years. There is one thing the rest of Northern Europe has learned: you do not mess with the Finns. Yes, they have a funny-sounding language. Those people beat tanks. On skis. Stay the frick out of Finland. Brian Acton interviewed at Facebook and got turned down. He said F it and built WhatsApp. Several years later, Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. Maurice Hilleman invented over 40 vaccines during his career in the pharmaceutical industry. In 1963, his oldest daughter caught the mumps. He cultured a sample from her, developed a vaccine, and injected it into his younger daughter. That vaccine is still in use and has saved millions of lives. In total, it's estimated that his work has saved 118 million lives globally. The guy who started FedEx wrote a college paper about a nationwide overnight shipping company and got a C. Started the company anyway. Later, after he started it and it was struggling, he couldn't get a loan and the company was almost bankrupt, and he bet next week's payroll at the casino on roulette and won. Also got a Silver Star in the Vietnam War and now co-owns the Washington Redskins. The latter often viewed as the biggest failure in his life. The giant Norse axeman who held the choke point at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. By the time the bulk of the English army had arrived, the Vikings on the west side were either slain or fleeing across the bridge. The English advance was then delayed by the need to pass through the choke point presented by the bridge itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has it that a single giant Norse axeman, possibly armed with a Dane axe, blocked the narrow crossing and single-handedly held up the entire English army. The story is that this axeman cut down 40 Englishmen and was defeated only when a single English soldier floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust his spear through the planks, mortally wounding the axeman. I'm surprised no one's mentioned Catherine the Great of Russia. She decided her husband was useless, which granted he was, and proceeded to set up a military coup to overthrow him. Even with the plan being discovered early, she dressed herself in military garb and marched with her new army, which had just sworn loyalty to her, down to Peter's palace, where he was forced to resign the throne, all without a single drop of blood shed. At least until Peter turned up dead sometime later under shady circumstances, but honestly, for a military coup, it was pretty non-violent. If saying, "F it, I'm ruling Russia myself," isn't great, I don't know what is. I mean, it's right there next to her name for a reason. It's incredible, especially considering A, she's a lady, and B, she wasn't Russian. C, she originally wasn't Russian Orthodox. Not a very old story. Manji, or the Mountain Man, lived in a very remote village of India, whose route to nearby was blocked by a mountain, and hence villagers had to climb it every time, and they had to do that daily to get essential supplies. During one of these trips, his wife fell down the mountain. He loved her a lot. He tried to persuade the government to do a mountain tunnel project there, but to no avail. So he went on alone to break the entire mountain with just an axe. He did that for 10+ years and finally succeeded. There's a Bollywood movie on him too, title Manji, the Mountain Man. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out Easy Mode, also linked below, and subscribe. Desmond Doss, single-handedly saved from 50 to 100 men up on Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa. His company was ordered to retreat when they were attacked by the Japanese, but instead he said, "Nah," stayed up on the ridge alone and unarmed, and dragged as many soldiers as he could to safety without any help. Even when he was shot by a sniper and riddled with shrapnel, he made sure they took another guy down the hillside before him. And yes, I'm aware there's a movie, I've read about him before that, and I know he's done more than just what's in the movie. I just didn't want to make a 3,000-word post about the many ways this guy is amazing. Australian stretcher bearer Leslie Allen did a similar thing on Mount Tambu. Carried out 12 men one at a time on his back alone. Received a Silver Star. James Clerk Maxwell was idolized by Einstein as being the father of modern physics. Not only did he formulate the classical theory of electromagnetic radiation, but just for craps and giggles, he calculated exactly what Saturn's rings were made of from using pure mathematics. It wasn't until Voyager 1 and 2 passed by and took photos in the early 80s that we got a confirmation that Maxwell was right. He then calculated how to take a color photograph back in 1855. This was then achieved in 1861 and is recognized as the first ever color photograph. In 1947, a guy named Thor Heyerdahl was trying to prove his theory that the Polynesian islands were settled by people from South America, not Asia. Nobody believed him because it was thought that crossing such a large ocean with the technology they had back then was impossible. So he decides to build a boat using only the tools and materials available at the time these migrations took place. And then he sailed the boat across the Pacific Ocean, nearly dying in the process, but ultimately making it to the Polynesian islands. Thor Heyerdahl was a bit of a madman. He also tried to prove that the ancient Egyptians could have crossed the Atlantic Ocean by rebuilding one of their boats and, well, sailing across. It took 2 tries, but they did it. It's still pretty unlikely that the Egyptians actually did sail across the Atlantic, but it's neat to know that they could have. Yes, and it's important to note that the prevailing theory is that even though Americans could have settled the Pacific Islands, it's more overwhelmingly likely that it was people from Asia. So, amazing feats of strength and endurance, Thor. Very impressive on both counts. You're still probably wrong though, mate. Juan Pujol Garcia was a Spaniard who created his own counterintelligence operation for the Allies during World War II. Initially, he approached the British and American intelligence to offer them his services, but both countries rebuffed him. Undeterred, Garcia created a fictional persona as a pro-fascist Spanish official and got himself recruited by the Third Reich, who directed him to travel to Britain to recruit agents. Instead, Garcia created a network of fictitious agents and sub-agents using publicly available information, like newspapers and travel brochures. It was at this point that he again contacted Allied intelligence and was finally recruited. Garcia continued his work throughout the war, and for the same operation he received both a knighthood from the British and the Iron Cross from Germany. The Germans never realized that he was a double agent. Yes, in the lead-up to Overlord, he confirmed reports that the Allied attack would come from Dover and wouldn't attack Normandy. Then, at the last moment, he confirmed that the Allies in fact would attack Normandy. But it was too late for the Germans to act on it. So afterwards, the Germans still trusted him, as they would point to him and say, he was the only one who predicted the Normandy invasion. It was technical issues, as always, that meant that the data got to us late. How about the doctor stationed in Antarctica that removed his own appendix? Gosh darn. When Nintendo turned down a collaboration with Sony, then Sony said, "Frick it, we'll do it ourselves." And the rest is history. To be fair, I think it's great that they did. Nintendo and Sony are so different, and there's plenty of room for both. Nintendo occupies a niche that I don't think they'll ever lose. Sony and Microsoft are locked in a never-ending war, yet Nintendo will always have their niche. Doesn't matter who wins the console war, Nintendo will claim second place. The first thing that comes to thought here is the Louisiana Purchase. Congress planned on buying a small piece of the available land, but Jefferson used some interpretation messery to double the size of the US without congressional approval. When Julius Caesar decided to just up and fricking march into Rome to declare himself the military leader. Or how about his Rhine bridges that he built in a few days to cross an army over a river, then went back over and demolished it just because his army could. It's said that the Germanic tribes saw his army do this and basically crapped themselves. Imagine being in some nomadic tribe and an invading force comes to a river, builds an entire bridge, crosses it, craps in your land, and then goes back home and destroys the entire bridge all in less than a week. Henry VIII couldn't get his way with the Pope, so he made the Church of England so that he could do what he wanted. This man legit made his own damn religion, which millions still follow today, just so he could get rid of his wife. A man who was a tractor mechanic company owner made a good chunk of money and bought a Ferrari. He thought that the car wasn't as good as it could be, and it wasn't very comfortable, so he brought his own complaints all the way to Enzo Ferrari, the owner of the company. Enzo insulted the man, saying that a mere tractor mechanic didn't know how to make a good sports car. That sparked a rivalry that lasts to this day. That man was Ferruccio Lamborghini. During the American Revolution, John Paul Jones sailed over to England to burn down British naval ships. He succeeded, of course, and made it back safely. After the revolution, he was even pardoned by the town that he burned most of the ships in. The guy in the war with wounded fingers, a doctor wouldn't amputate them, so he bit them off himself. My great-grandpa did the opposite. They were going to amputate his feet in World War II, and he said, nah. So he went AWOL and treated his own wounded feet on his own. When he came back with two perfectly good feet, he basically said, I wanted to keep my feet and I wanted to keep fighting. And as far as I know, he didn't get any kind of punishment, even though he was gone for weeks. I imagine they would have sent him back home if they'd amputated his feet, so hard to call him a deserter for running off, especially if he came back to fight. Leonid Rogozov removing his own appendix, or Inez Ramirez Perez for doing her own C-section. Rogozov was a good doctor, and Perez was a poor Mexican woman. The guy who made body armor and shot himself to test it. I mean, I'd use a test dummy for the first few times myself. Judging by the guy's decisions, I would call him a test dummy. Metallica fired Dave Mustaine in 1983 because he was sort of a control freak and wanted to take the band in a more prog or jazz metal direction. He was also way overdoing it with substances and was known for violent behavior at the time. He went off and created his own band Megadeth, and over the next 30+ years he'd sold millions of albums and toured the whole world writing and controlling pretty much everything he had ever wanted. It seems they've now patched all the things up. The guy's an absolute genius and beast of a guitarist and songwriter. Even as a guy who knows nothing about the heavier music, that is amazing. The author has a runner-up story attached to the coattails of this absolute legend. Also, when guitarist Hillel Slovak died in 1988, John Frusciante was a 19-year-old kid and a huge fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He was heartbroken and didn't want to see the end of his favorite band. So he went and auditioned to play the lead guitar. He got the gig, helped take them to the top of the charts. The rest is history, and today he's considered one of the greatest rock guitarists out there. Martine Rothblatt, founder of SiriusXM and an unbelievable polymath, was told her daughter Genesis had 3 months to live. She had been diagnosed with a type of pulmonary arterial hypertension which was fatal. The disease causes too much pressure in the blood vessels leading from the heart to the lungs, causing them to narrow and not carry enough oxygen. So Rothblatt quit all of her other work and went to the library to save her daughter. Even though she had zero background in the field, she figured out a cure and in the process founded United Therapeutics, which is a billion-dollar biotechnology company. Rothblatt's life story is amazing. Marie Curie. a Polish and French chemist and a physicist who, without going into great detail, died of constant exposure to radiation while seeking a cure for others, more or less sacrificing herself as a human guinea pig, knowing full well the consequences of her actions. Here in Scotland, we have many Marie Curie charity shops who provide funds for hospices and the like. I'm pretty sure she's responsible for saving my butt and many countless others for her pioneering works. Was quoted in 1912 as saying, "F it, I'll do it myself," possibly paraphrased. Clara Lemlich taking the stage at a union meeting in 1909 to declare a general strike after the older male union leaders told the working girls that there wasn't really a point in striking and it would be too hard, just be patient and deal with it. So 20-year-old Clara interrupts them, climbs up on the stage and shouts at the crowd, "I have listened to all the speeches and I have no further patience for talk. I too have worked and suffered and I am tired of talk. I move that we go on general strike. Now." And everyone went for it, instant agreement from the workers. The Soviet woman who lost her husband in World War II to the Germans, who sold everything to pay for a tank with the request that she got to drive it to fight them. Go and read up about Maria Oktyabrskaya on Wikipedia. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, after an expedition, I think to the Arctic, had frostbitten digits on one hand. After becoming irritated and uncomfortable waiting for the doctors to sort out treatment, he went to his garden shed and amputated them himself. George Clooney bought his own spy satellite to prove the alleged crimes of an African warlord because nobody else would. The kicker is that he's using all of his earnings from shilling Nespresso to do it. Also, I thought he was buying time on it and didn't outright purchase the satellite. Here's a notable mention, albeit somewhat obscure. Sam Regenstrief once made 40% of the dishwashers in the USA at the time. He fell ill with a kidney stone and went to his local hospital in Indiana. Upon leaving, he was disgusted by the waiting times and quality of care. He took matters into his own hands and created a hospital and founded the Regenstrief Institute. This institute helped map the genome of COVID-19 and translated its findings into 20-plus languages, helping the world fight this virus. Henry Ford proposed to buy Ferrari so that Ford could be competitive in the performance car market. The deal was about to be signed, but Enzo only wanted to sell the commercial Ferrari division and not the racing arm. So Henry Ford said F it, and thus was born the Ford GT40. Enzo is pretty much the reason two other sports car companies exist. Leroy Jenkins! Oh my god, he just ran in. Stick to the plan. God damn it, Leroy! When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out Easy Mode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.